Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Andi Mulyana from Class C English Literature 2020. Alright, from this video, I will explain my mind map about the 20th century and after. Alright, for the first, I will explain about the introduction about the 20th century. Alright, universal education, even if just in basic reading and writing, produced a general reading public that in turn generated demand for popular fiction. A widening gulf emerged between so-called serious art and popular art. Similarly, the more generous and mass-produced, popular literature became the more experimental, challenging, and avant-garde some modern artists become, as a thought reacting against literature that tried to appeal to a lowest common denominator. Already by the last decades of the Victorian period, the authors were turning away from the optimism and triumphalism that had marked the early and mid-Victorian periods. Alright, next, modernism and the modern novel. Modernism is often derided for abandoning the social world in favor of its narcissistic interest in language and its process. Recognizing the failure of language to ever fully communicate meaning. That's not it at all. That's not what I mean at all. Lemons Eliot G. Alfred Prufrock. And while modernists have made little impact on the practices of reading and writing, as those terms and activities are generally understood, the opening of Finnegans Wake, Riverrun, past Evans and Adams, from Swerve offshore to Burn the Bind, brings us by a commodious species of resiculation back to Hout Castle and environs. Seems scarcely less strange and new than when it was first published in 1939. Next, some of the features of modernist aesthetic work include: first, self-reflexivity, as in Picasso's Women in the Studio on the left. The second, an exploration of psychological and subjective states, combined sometimes with a rejection of realism or objective representation, as in Expressionism or a stream of consciousness writing. The third, alternative ways of thinking about representation. For example, Cubism, which attempts to see the same event or object from multiple perspectives at the same time. The fourth, radical experimentation in form, including a breakdown in generic distinction. Example, between poetry and prose, with the French prose poem and the poetic prose of Gertrude Stein or Virginia Woolf as prominent examples. The fifth, fragmentation in form and representation. For example, T.S. Eliot in Wasteland. The sixth, extreme ambiguity and simultaneity in structure. For example, William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, which offers the same events from a radically different focalized perspective. The seventh, some experimentation in the breakdown between high and low form. For example, Eliot's and Joyce's inclusion of folk and pop cultural material in their work, though rarely in a way that is easily understandable by the general masses. And the last, the use of parody and irony in artistic creation. For example, James Joyce's Ulysses or the creation of the Charlottes and Deadettes. thought again in a way that tends to be difficult for the mass consumer to understand. And next, some of the things that distinguish postmodern aesthetic work from modernist work are as follows. This same self-reflexivity can be found everywhere in pop culture. For example, the way the Scream series of movies has created characters debating generic rules behind the horror film. In modernism, self-reflexivity tended to be used by high artists in difficult works. For example, Picasso's painting above. In postmodernism, self-reflexive strategies can be found in both high art and everything from Seinfeld to MTV. And the second, irony and parody. Connect to the former point is the tendency of postmodern artists, theorists, and culture to be playful or parodic. The third, a breakdown between high and low cultural forms. Whereas some modernists experimented with the same breakdown, even the modernists that play with pop forms, for example Joyce and Eliot, tended to be extremely difficult to follow in their experimentation. Postmodernists, by contrast, often employ pop and mass-produced objects in more immediately understandable ways, even if their goals are still often complex. For example, Andy Warhol's commentary on mass production and on the commercial aspect of high art thought the exact reproduction of a set of Campbell's soap boxes on the left. The fourth is retro. Postmodernists and postmodern culture tend to be especially fascinated with styles and fashion from the past, which they will often use completely out of their original context. The fifth is a questioning of grand narratives. Lyotard sees the breakdown of the narratives that formerly legitimized the status quo as an important aspect of postmodern condition. Of course, modernists also questioned such traditional concepts as law, religion, subjectivity, and nationhood. The sixth is visuality and simulacrum versus temporality. Given the predominance of visual media, TV, film, media advertising, the computer, both postmodern art and postmodern culture gravitate towards visual, often even two-dimensional forms as in the cartoons of Roy Lichtenstein, example on the right. A good example of this and of the breakdown between high and low forms is art Speckman's Mouse, Pulitzer's prize-winning rendition of Friedrich Spiegelman's experience in the Holocaust. Seventh is late capitalism. There is also a general sense that world has been taken over by the values of capitalist acquisition, that alternatives no longer exist. The eighth is disorientation. MTV culture is again sometimes cited as an example as a postmodern architecture, which attempts to disorient the subject and tearing its space. And the last is secondary orality, whereas literacy rates had been rising steadily from the introduction of poem through the modern period. Postmodern society has seen a drastic reversal in this trend as more and more people are now functionally illiterate, relying instead on an influx of oral media sources, TV, film, radio, and etc. In 20th century, there is poetry, fiction, and drama. And let's talk about poetry. The early 20th century, between about 90s and the First World War saw the beginning of radical new experiment in poetry. The love song of G. Alfred Prufrock contains a good example in its opening lines. Let us go down, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a pattern raised upon a table. While returning to a more precise language, however, poets of the mid-century were not so concerned to return to a style heavy with elision and intellectualism. And next is fiction. Despite its diversity, modern novels typically focus on themes like the individual in society and the temporality of human existence. In this early stage, the modernist novel turned inward to contemplate the workings of the individual mind. And the last is drama. Modernist drama on the continent became increasingly self-conscious or aware of itself as drama. Word feeling of impatience, cultural fatigue, and alienation. From this post-war period, English drama traveled along different trajectories, including Beckett's theater of the absurd, but also the social realism of John Osborne and Harold Pinter. Alright, let's move to the next material. Is postmodern prayers. For the first is Linda Hutcheon. In her books, The Politics of Postmodernism and The Poetic of Postmodernism has outlined some of the major aesthetic features of postmodern literature, particularly of what the terms historiographic metafiction. And the second is Jean Baudrillard is the sobering critical culture voice, the Hutcheon's theorist. Painting a black picture of the future, Baudrillard critiques what he sees as the emptying of all materiality in a culture increasingly governed. He argues by the postmodern simulacrum. And the last is Frederick Jameson. Like Baudrillard, offers a critical view of our present age. In particular, the dangers of multinational capitalism. He also warns against the dangers that result from what he sees as our society's loss of connection with history and with the suffering of the oppressor. Alright, I think that's all can I explain. Thank you. I think enough. And the last essay, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.